This is episode, oh, hold on. This is episode 214 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This week, we are pleased to have Katherine Stevens. She is an expert and resident scholar on issues including child welfare, early childhood education, as well as poverty issues. She's with the American Enterprise Institute, AEI.org. They're based in Washington, D.C., one of the preeminent center-right think tanks in the country. And she's on Twitter at KB Stevens, Stevens. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Katherine.
Thanks very much, Paul.
Yeah, well, for those of us on Facebook, we're restarting, and we've talked about a few things, but hopefully the sound quality is much better now. And there's a lot going on in New Mexico on the issue of pre-K and early childhood learning. As I see it, and I know, Katherine, you're not as up to speed on the political dynamics, but we had a primary election in June. Among the defeated moderate Democrats, so to speak, was John Arthur Smith, who's protected New Mexico's permanent funds. He lost, so the Democrats, and assuming that they control the legislature, which there's an election here, all 112 of them are up for election, we're going to be having a serious discussion about early childhood spending, pre-K, and the like. And we've talked before, and I wanted to get an update from you on some of the new research coming out about early childhood learning and pre-K and the like, and just talk about what New Mexico is doing or has done and whether it's going to be effective or not. So glad to have you back on, Katherine, and just share kind of where your take is on the general topic of early childhood and learning in this regard.
Well, from what I've been able to gather about what's going on in New Mexico, I think the governor, who I know has been very supportive of pre-K, and other advocates are really off base in a pretty important way. They're promoting what they're describing as early childhood education. What I would argue is that it actually isn't those things. And I say that for two reasons. The first is that when we talk about education, what we're really talking about is a process of human development. And over the last 50 years, we in our society, in the United States, we have come to equate human development with schooling. So the first problem is when we talk about early childhood education, what we really mean is early childhood development, but we're kind of in a rut with our thinking. And so we are assuming that we accomplish development through school. So that's the first problem. The second problem is at least as big, which is that from a K-12 viewpoint, age 4 is early. However, from a scientifically based perspective on human development, age 4 is not early at all. So when people in New Mexico and elsewhere say they're promoting early childhood education, it's neither really education in the way that young children need to develop, nor is it early childhood. So the science is clear that if your goal is to advance the well-being and healthy development of the most disadvantaged children, which is often the reason given, at least publicly, for adding a 14th grade onto the public school system, there are much better trees to be barking up.
Got it. So you imply that government should do something earlier on in a child's life, and I know that home visits are a part of what advocates are pushing for here, but you're talking about earlier than those early childhood visits, those home visits. Talk about what those kinds of things would look like. What would an effective program for improving outcomes for young, our youngest people, little babies even, what would that all look like?
Right. Well, I think just as a general principle, what we know is a lot of well-intended interventions just don't work very well. We wish they worked, we want them to work, but they don't. And that's a problem because it wastes taxpayer dollars. You could argue it's even a worse problem because now you have people who really did need help who have not been helped. So as a general principle, it is for people who care about advancing the well-being of disadvantaged young children, which I assume is what people in New Mexico are talking about. It is essential that that we pay much more attention to the evidence base for programs in a kind of a continuous way. So that's just sort of a blanket statement that there are a number of things which I'll describe in a minute that in theory are a much better bet than pre-K. They're worth trying, but we need to get much better at rather than what often happens is you sort of pick a program and you say, oh well, I know this program works, and you just do that program no matter what. That's just not sufficient for achieving the outcomes that I think a lot of well-intended people want to achieve for kids. So as I was mentioning to you earlier, there's very rapidly growing research that the prenatal period is enormously important for children's development. It's actually called the perinatal period, means the prenatal period and the following year. So just as a starting point, that should be, I would argue that should be close to 100% of the focus. Because if you don't get that right, all the school in the world, whether it happens when a kid's 4 or 5 or 6 or at any time, is really not it's going to be spitting into the wind. So there's another issue in this arena is we've also been states have tended to rely on their social services, their social services, human services, and education departments for addressing these issues. And the healthcare system is really underutilized. If you think about it, the obstetricians and pediatricians are the frontline workers. They reach essentially all children in our society. And that system is not being leveraged adequately. We're not thinking about it. And if, for all of the energy that's going into thinking about how to add a 14th grade to the school system, if we turn that energy to thinking about how to maximize the value of prenatal care and pediatric care that understands that a baby does not exist in a vacuum. A pediatrician is really treating a baby mother dyad. And that's something that that research is becoming increasingly clear is where we'll get a lot of bang for our buck.
So are we talking about nutrition in utero, nutrition early on? Are we talking about, playing Mozart for babies in the womb? Or
right.
what kind of specific things would you recommend if somebody who was pregnant with a little baby here in New Mexico, could be around the country, could be in Thailand, China? What kind of things should we be doing here in New Mexico from a public policy or from just a parent perspective to
Yeah.
improve outcomes for our kids?
Yeah. So we know that we've known for quite a long time that nutrition is essential for developing babies. We also know that that drugs and alcohol are not at all good for developing babies. A really fascinating new area of research is showing that the effect, that the mother's effect on the growing fetus goes beyond those kinds of physical things, and that the mother's mental health can have a profound impact on the developing fetus. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're pregnant and you have a bad day, your baby is not going to develop well. What research is showing is that when pregnant women are experiencing chronic stress or depression, so chronic stress, that does not mean you were in a bad traffic jam, like I said, you had a bad day. That means that just day after day after day, you are extremely stressed. You're homeless. You're worried you're going to get evicted. You don't think you're going to have enough resources to be able to bring your child up. You have a boyfriend who comes over and beats you up, those kinds of things. And what they've found is that the fetus is actually affected by the lack of mental health of women. So just to give an example of the level that this occurs on, for example, the cortisol, which is a hormone associated with stress, does not cross the placenta usually. So a growing fetus is not exposed to cortisol that is in the mother's body. So if the mother gets all of a sudden scared, there's cortisol, it does not affect the fetus. What they found is that when a woman is under sustained stress, it appears to deactivate a protein that blocks the cortisol from crossing the placenta. So they're finding that that growing babies of extremely stressed pregnant women are actually being exposed to cortisol when they're developing. So one effect of that is a really fascinating kind of experiment. When they bring pregnant women into a lab and they administer some kind of stress test in the lab, they give them like a really hard question to answer. What they find is that for normally, the woman gets stressed. They test her heartbeat and her breathing. She gets stressed, but the fetus shows no response. With women who are experiencing these chronic poor mental health, what they've found is that the fetus responds along with the mother. Like the fetus is jumpier, and when those babies are born, they tend to be more reactive, kind of less balanced. So that's just a sort of a very brief picture of what's at stake. And when you start thinking about that, the idea that you'd be focusing so much energy and money on whether that child will get to go to school when he's 4 or when he's 5, it just doesn't make any sense at all. It is the case that some substantial number of women are becoming mothers before they are ready emotionally, financially. They may be young, they may be very isolated. The problem of poor maternal health with young, poor women is huge. they are often, as you know, they can be very isolated. They don't have people around who can support them. They themselves don't feel loved and safe. And that is enormously detrimental to the developing baby, and then once the baby's born. So the kinds of interventions that address that problem, that give a mother a sense of confidence and agency in becoming a mother once she's in the position she's chosen that's what's going to happen. Those kinds of interventions are the most promising that we have to change trajectories for the most disadvantaged kids.
Okay, so I think the public policy implications are, that obviously you need to get started very early in terms of helping these children. I don't know that I've seen, any evidence from anybody that there's a lot that government can really do here. It seems to me that if you wanted to solve some of these problems, the public policy response should be to work to restore the two-parent family and put fathers back in the homes and do all those kinds of things. Now, that's definitely not on the table, but barring that, is there anything that you see or we've got evidence that it is effective around the country, around the world for actually changing this dynamic? Because it really does get beyond, another grade of school, as you say, or whatever.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and what I would say is, with respect to your first point, Paul, that it is not good for the mothers or babies when babies are born into a situation where the people are their mother is not ready. So the whole question of how we can encourage young people to have, if not being married, a stable two-person relationship before bringing a child into the world, that is the upstream solution. The problem is that once a baby is born into adverse conditions, that baby is a human who, from a kind of a moral and spiritual point of view, we may feel obligated to do whatever we can for that baby. And frankly, from a dollars and cents point of view, we know that those babies are likely to be the very most expensive for society, starting in school and going way beyond that in terms of dropout rates, themselves getting pregnant too young, crime, unemployment, all that stuff. So, it's difficult because on the one hand, we want to greatly reduce the number of people who are in that circumstance, and on the other hand, once they are, I think there are several reasons why it makes sense for us to do our best to improve the situation. So with respect to, and as I said, I think that the medical system as a delivery system in early childhood makes much more sense than school. The reality is about 50% of babies in this country are born on Medicaid. And my guess would be that in New Mexico, that rate may be higher.
Much higher. I believe 75% is the ratio of babies born in New Mexico.
What percent did you say?
75.
So, Paul, I'm not hearing you. Are you?
Yeah, we lost you for a minute, but it was 75%.
Oh.
of baby.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay, exactly. So, you know, the best thing to do from the point of view of child welfare and public expense is to prevent babies from being born into very inoptimal circumstances in the first place, right? Once they are about to be born or they're going to be born, the earlier we intervene, the better. And so here you have 75%, say, of babies being born on Medicaid, and it's not difficult to figure out which of those. Some women may just simply be poor. They and their husband work at very low paying jobs, but some of those women may be very much at risk, and it would be obvious to us that they're young. They either there's no father in the picture, or the relationship with the father is not good. They're isolated, they're poor, they have low education. These are all risk factors. If you have all of these in a person, the idea of waiting to, as I said before, the idea of waiting to pay for them to go to school a year earlier is nonsensical. So we have this group of people who are, and among them is going to be the very most vulnerable people, and they're all going to obstetricians, or the large majority, and they're essentially all of them are going to a pediatrician, if not as regularly as recommended, a number of times in the first couple of years of the child's life. So this is an example of a very creative way of improving that kind of care. So the normal Medicaid visit, the normal Medicaid visit pays for 15 minutes. So we can see that 15 minutes is not going to be sufficient for a doctor to spend any time with someone who seems to be in trouble. And doctors who are working with a lot of such women are, you can imagine, will be feeling stressed with so many needs showing up, and they're not able to do anything about it. So there's this wonderful initiative called, it's got a funny name, it's called the Centering Institute, I think is what they call it. And what they've done is they've created groups of women. And so instead of each woman using 15 minutes for each of her visits, they pool them in a group of 8. So they have 2 hours. And they run both the pregnancy checkup visits and the well baby visits after babies are born in groups of Medicaid women. Their results have been extraordinary. So it's not perfect, but they are getting some very, very good results, because those groups are providing for women what they need to be good parents to their children. Support, people to talk to, not feeling alone, in addition to concrete information about what they need to be doing and what's at stake. And there's actually research that shows that group therapy for any kind of problem, like Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, is very effective. Group therapy is a very effective way for people to change their thinking and their behavior. So that is one program that I find very exciting. Have been expanding across the country. They've been doing a very good job with expansion. They're very rigorous about evaluating their outcomes on an ongoing basis, and addressing less than optimal outcomes in a quick, fast. There's also I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Government driven. I presume it's either Medicaid funded or some kind
it's
of
Medicaid funded. It doesn't cost any extra dollars, Paul, because it literally uses the existing publicly, I mean, Medicaid itself costs money, right? But this doesn't cost extra, because instead of 8 women paying for 15 minutes each, you just pool it. So you have 8 women and they're paying for a collective 2 hours.
And is this
They aren't medicated.
Across the country, only in certain states, kind of a pilot program situation?
It was a pilot program, and they have expanded into several different states. I'll send you information on it after our conversation. And it's the kind of thing that the people who run it the way they developed it was very careful and rigorous. They ran it as a pilot project, and they started to grow and grow. But they're fighting an uphill battle, because when people think about early childhood, and we're going to be doing something in early childhood, they don't think about creative, innovative ways to improve perinatal care, the prenatal period in the first year. They don't think about that. They think about adding a grade to the school system. Mm-hmm. And so this group does not get as much attention as these other kinds of things. It's not, a kitchen, topic of kitchen table discussion. But I'm seeing growing focus on the need for solutions to be a need for us to be focusing more on the medical system in terms of thinking about solutions.
Well, it seems like, and you talked about social isolation and some of these issues and economic uncertainty. And I know probably nobody has a study out yet, but I've got to think that COVID-19 and the outbreak is not going to be particularly helpful to outcomes when it comes to these low-income families, especially had serious employment uncertainty and financial uncertainty as relates to this virus. But if you start from a position of some level of social isolation and lack of a support base, that's going to be doubly important. I wonder if they're even continuing those kind of support groups in any way, because so much of that has ground to a halt. I mean, some people might have things and those kinds of things, but those are by nature going to be higher level income folks to begin with. So anyway, just food for thought there.
Yep. I mean, there's no question about that. And I think, one of the things I've been noticing at the federal level is there's just been this massive push for additional funds going to childcare, which is sort of an extension of childcare is more useful to low-income working families than pre-K is, but it's in the same kind of bucket as early care and education programs. So there's a push for, the most common number is $50 billion into childcare, and the other funding streams, like, for example, federal funding programs, for example, focusing on child abuse, on home visiting, as you just mentioned, those programs, nobody's paying any attention to them. So there's $100 million. These are just gigantic numbers, but $100 million. It's just a tiny fraction for those programs. And one of the things that I find actually disturbing is that people who describe themselves as early childhood advocates are actually, in my observation, behaving more like early childhood program advocates. In other words, I'm not seeing people advocating for the well-being of young children. I'm seeing people advocate for programs, in particular for childcare and pre-K programs. Well, and that's a bad direction.
Right where we are right now. And, as schools struggle with whether to come back and all those kinds of things this fall, if they were advocating for the child. And I know we could go off on a tangent, and I'm not going to on K-12. I'm actually going to ask you about the new Legislative Finance Committee study, and you've been working on a critique of it. But the K-12 advocacy should be about getting funds and resources to the children and their families themselves, because who knows if school's going to be even starting this August. They should be talking about resources that are needed, and getting them online, getting them up to speed, training parents, all those kinds of things. And we're just not seeing much of that. But let's move on to this LFC report. It is called Program Evaluation, Pre-Kindergarten Quality and Educational Outcomes. It was published June the 10th of 2020, so it's about a month old. And you have some thoughts on it, but basically the idea, conclusion of this report is that the pre-K programs that the state has been rolling out here for several years are effective, they're cost effective, and we should be doing more of them. You're not exactly sold on the methodology and the findings of the report, so tell us a little bit about your critique of it.
So the first problem with this report, the first error that it makes, is a common one, and that is it is identifying a correlation between children who attend pre-K and really very small, better school outcomes, but not by much. However, what basic statistics tells us is that just because there's two variables are correlated does not mean that one of them caused the other. There are two other possibilities. One is it's just chance. There is an extraordinary website, which your listeners and viewers might want to check out. It's called Spurious Correlations, spuriouscorrelations.com. And what the guy who runs it has now for years been collecting massive data, which he is then able, he's able to show these absurd correlations. So one example is that the per capita consumption of margarine and the divorce rate in Maine were perfectly correlated from 2000 to 2009, for example. I mean, the lines are just perfectly matched. So that is an example of a correlation which is just chance. There's nothing about margarine that's causing divorce or vice versa. The second explanation, besides a causal one for two variables being correlated, is that it's not causal, it's not chance. However, there is a third unmeasured, unaccounted for variable that causes both of them. So an example is the more fire engines that are called to a fire, the more damage the fire does. It's not the case that fire engines are causing the fire damage. What's happening is there is a third variable, which is the size of the fire, that is affecting both how many fire engines are going and the damage that occurs. Another example like that is ice cream sales are very closely correlated with air conditioner sales. People don't buy more air conditioners because they're eating ice cream. What's happening is there's a third variable that's not apparent in the correlation between ice cream and air conditioner sales, which is hot summer weather, which drives both increased ice cream sales and increased air conditioner sales. So those are two examples of a correlation between variable A and B being driven by an entirely third variable X. And I think it is by far the most likely that the correlation, any correlation that exists, and as I said before, it's a small one, between pre-K attendance and improved school outcomes is caused by an unobserved, unaccounted for third factor. And that factor is parents. So the reason that I think this is clear is that unlike all the subsequent school grades, pre-K is voluntary. So the only children who are in pre-K are the children who have parents who are engaged enough in their children, engaged enough for their children, care enough about their children's education, and are motivated enough to find a pre-K program, get their children into it, and get them there for every day for a full year. Though by doing that, those parents are demonstrating exactly what we know results in children's better outcomes later on. So a child who goes to pre-K has the same parents as the child who is later has better attendance or is doing better on the fourth grade test or whatever. So I think that is it's actually almost shocking, or actually shocking, that we would look at those two variables, a correlation between those two variables, and be willing to just assume that one causes the other, when, especially when there is this other explanation which makes so much more sense. And as a matter of fact, there have been the only way to assess the actual effect of a pre-K program is to compare children who have the same kind of parents. So you're not actually detecting the effect of parenting rather than pre-K. There are two studies that have done that. They're called randomized controlled trials. One was of a high quality Tennessee state pre-K program, and the other was of the federal Head Start program. The way those studies were both run is they took a large group, several thousand children, all of whose parents were trying to get them into the program. The program did not have enough spaces for the children, so they randomly let some children in and other children did not get in. The other children did not go to pre-K, but that wasn't because their parents never tried. They had parents who were trying just as hard as the parents of the children who did get in. And what they found in both of these studies is the same thing. At the end of the pre-K year, the children who attended pre-K do a little better. But through the kindergarten year, the children who did not go to pre-K catch up. And in both of these studies, by second and third grade, the children who went to pre-K are actually doing a little worse. So the difference between the Tennessee pre-K study and the Head Start study, and what the Legislative Finance Committee report is doing, is the Tennessee study and the Head Start study were comparing apples to apples. They were comparing children who had parents who were engaged and motivated and trying to get them into a program with other children whose parents were engaged and motivated and trying to get them into the program. What the LAC program the LAC evaluation does instead is it is comparing one group of children who have parents who are motivated and trying to get them into a program, and another group of children whose parents are not doing that. So that's an apples to oranges comparison.
Right.
And it what that means is that it means that it's unlikely that correlation is a causal one.
Okay. Well, we have just a few minutes to go, but another question, and we talked briefly about it, is cost effectiveness. Now, I'm shifting over to a recent op-ed that Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham wrote in the Sunday Albuquerque Journal, which was New Mexico must keep early childhood momentum going. We'll have links to both the LFC report and this opinion piece, but the governor wrote that pre-K has a return on investments indicating that for every dollar invested, these programs save our state $6 in education, healthcare costs, and other costs. What do you make of that particular statement? Where is she getting that from? any details you can shower on us would be great.
Right. So I think that coming up with numbers like that, when you're talking about spending limited public resources on behalf of children and families who are in need of help, I think it could actually be called irresponsible. Because if in fact those numbers are based on the kinds of studies that I was just talking about, where you take a group of children who had engaged, motivated parents, and you imagine that their later outcomes are caused by 1 year of school rather than having more engaged and motivated parents, as I said. So in the kind of calculation that you just described, what is being calculated is how much money it saves the state when children have more engaged, motivated parents. That what's being described as the effects of pre-K are actually the effects of parenting. And you have to be pretty darn sure that that's not the case before you are spending scarce public dollars, in theory, to help disadvantaged children in a way which is just simply not going to help them. So that is the first problem. The second problem is, in the LAC report, they seem to have a misunderstanding of how the concept of cost effectiveness is used in public policy. The idea of cost effectiveness is not to show that later outcomes cover the initial cost of the program. The idea of cost effectiveness is to compare various alternatives to determine which of those alternatives yield the most benefit for the dollars spent. So you cannot do a cost effectiveness analysis without looking at various alternatives. A good way for New Mexico to do cost effective analysis, if the goal is assuming that the goal is to help disadvantaged children and families, is, for example, to invite the Centering Institute to do a pilot project in New Mexico and to do rigorous studies, randomized controlled studies of centering and pre-K to see which one yields greater benefit for limited dollars. That should be the goal, is getting the most benefit for limited public resources. So it's if your goal is to expand the school system and help out wealthier parents who otherwise have to pay for preschool themselves, then pre-K makes perfect sense. If your goal is to help disadvantaged children, there's just not a case to be made that a 14th grade added to the school system is the best way of doing that. I don't think it does it at all, but it certainly is not the best way to do it.
All right. Well, Katherine, time has flown. We are at the end of our time together. If folks want to read some of your research and information, I know we talked about you're working on a document or a policy brief and an op-ed relating to the situation in New Mexico and this study and some of what the governor's trying to do. But in general, where should people go to find out more about your work?
My website, if you go to aei.org and you just do a search for my name, Katherine, Katharine Stevens, my page at AEI pops up with all of my work.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. And I know I will talk to you soon, and we'll hope to see your work in the New Mexico media, throwing some facts at the advocates for this public policy issue, this latest spending boondoggle, in our opinion. And Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.